Hello everyone, I'm here today to do another of my Reader on the World project videos, and this is going to be for Central Asia. So I'm defining that as Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So let's start with Azerbaijan. The book I read for Azerbaijan was Ali and Nino by Kirhan Said, which is kind of a semi-classical book, and it's basically sort of a romance. So Ali is a Muslim man, his family is from Persia, and Nino is a Georgian woman, so her family is Christian, and they both grew up in Baku in Azerbaijan, and this is the time when Russians were around a little bit, kind of, and they are like 17, 18 when the book starts, and they are in love, and they ask their parents to get married, and despite the parents being different cultures and different religions, they say yes. They have not a big issue with that. They think, oh, Nino is a nice girl, Ali is a nice boy, yeah, that's fine, which I was not expecting, because it sounded that at first, and it was sold to me like sort of a Romeo and Juliet kind of thing, but the parents were completely fine with it. The problem started when there was war, so the Russians went into Baku, and then they had to move away from Baku, and they moved to Persia. And then Nino had to be confined to the harem and live like a Muslim woman, like dressed with a veil and all of that, and she was not okay with that. And so when Baku is safe again, they go back again and they can be themselves again. And there's a point in which it seems that it's going to be attacked again, and so there was the option to go to Europe, but again Ali doesn't want to go because the same is gonna happen to him in the other side, and there is this whole conflict between the European Christian aspect of life in Baku and the Muslim Asian part of Baku, and this clash of cultures. And they realized, Ali and Nino realized, that the only way that they can be together is if they are in Baku, because Baku allows them to be themselves and still be together. And I found it really interesting, just because I think that normally in romances the reasons why a couple might not stay together are external, but in this case they were internal. The conflict was that they are from different cultures and there is a cultural clash, rather than people from their families telling them they cannot be together. And I thought that was really nice, and I really appreciated the book. I really enjoyed it, much more than I thought I was going to, I think. Then the next book I read was Three Apples from the Sky by Narine Abgaryan. I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher all the names, and that's from Armenia. And this book is set in a very small rural village in the mountains in Armenia, and we follow a set of characters. It's kind of like a slice of life of the village, but mostly like there's a couple that we follow more than others, and there is tales of friendship and hardship, and I just thought it was going to be not exactly uplifting, but a bit of a lighter or a bit of a more humorous read. But to me, it wasn't. It has been described as humorous, but I couldn't see that. Like, there was so much brutality. There were famines, there was war, there was all of the things, and the village is wiped off completely almost several times. There were only a few people left, and like there's a point in which a baby is born and they're like, oh, it's the only baby in the village because everyone else, all the other kids died in the famine last year. I was like, wow, how is this like funny? So yeah, very brutal. It was well written and it was fine, but it was too brutal for me, I think. It was also just like a matter-of-fact way of saying these things, so it just felt a little bit like very heavy. Then for Kazakhstan, I read The Dead Wonder in the Desert by Rollan Seisenbayev, and this is it's a fairly chunky book, and it's set in Kazakhstan, obviously around the Aral Sea, in 1989, I think 1988, 1999. So exactly when the USSR was going down. A lot of the books in this region, understandably, lead with a lot of books in this region, understandably, deal with Russian and like the Russian occupation and all of that, which is interesting to read them in conjunction. I read most of these books after each other, so I could really pick the themes of the Russians controlling people's lives and communism and all of that, and it's also in this book, in The Dead Wander in the Desert. But I would say the main point of this book is about the ecological disaster that was the disappearance of the Aral Sea. So part of that has to do with the Russian control, but basically there were several dams built and several political decisions made around the Aral Sea that meant that it started drying up more and more and became sort of like a desert land. And there are a lot of pictures of very old boats stranded in the sand, no water whatsoever to be seen around, and it was a huge ecological disaster. And this book focuses on one of the villages around there, and it's a fisherman village. There were a lot of fishermen that depended on the Aral Sea to live, and when it disappears, which happens at the beginning of the book, it's not like the book doesn't follow so much the sea disappearing, but it's more of like the water has disappeared, what do we do now? Some people have faith that it's gonna come back, some people accept that it's not gonna come back and move to the cities or decide to raise cattle instead, and there is this dichotomy of people deciding either like to look for a life elsewhere or to stay where their ancestors were, which was very important for some of them, but don't have a life anymore because their skills are useless in a desert. They are fishermen. So yeah, there is a lot of conflicts on that, and as I said, there is also politics involved with the decisions that were made that ended up in that disaster. And there is also, it's told in a very fairly poetic way, and there are a lot of characters, and there is also like snippets of poems or songs or newspaper cuttings, stuff like that. It's all over the place in this book, and although I think it was a very accomplished book, and I think what it is doing, it's very important story to tell, and I would love more people to read this. It did feel very dense, so it took me a while to go through it, just because the reading was slow for me, and I think it's important to know that going into the book doesn't mean that the book is bad or that you shouldn't read it, but go into it knowing that it's a dense book and it's going to take you a while, but it's worth it, I would say. And the same, I think, goes for the next book, which is for Uzbekistan, and that's The Devil Dance by Hamid Ismailov. So this is about a writer in the early 1900s in like Uzbekistan, and again the Russians are a big part of it. So the Russians take this writer and put him in prison because of something that he wrote or something that he said, and then we follow like what his life in prison is, and it's again very dense, and it has a lot about religion and politics and the government control and all of that, which is again a topic that is very present in a lot of these books. The Russian government and control is in many of these books, but yeah, in this one it's very dense as well, and I particularly don't enjoy reading about writers. It's not something that some books I have read about writers I liked, but most of them just feel a little bit pretentious sometimes, and this one did feel a little bit on that aspect. Not pretentious is not the right word, but a little bit convoluted maybe, and yeah, that made it slow, and that made it a little bit more difficult for me to connect with the characters. Again, I could see the merit of the book. I could see that it was a very well written book, but it was just a little bit too difficult for me to connect with. So yeah. Then the next book was The Tale of Aypi by Ak Welsapar. It's from Turkmenistan, and this again follows several fishermen that are losing their village in the Caspian Sea because of the Russians again. And it's kind of like what the decisions of what the village is gonna do as a community. And I didn't expect this book to have such a feminist tone, but it did. Like, the people in this village that were the ones that wanted to fight and the ones that wanted to stand up for themselves were the women. The men were like, oh yeah, but they want us to leave, so we're leaving. And the women were like, what kind of people are you? We have to stay and fight. It's a very short book. But I think it can be very powerful as well. And yeah, I enjoyed it. And then the next book that I read was The Eighth Life by Nino Haratischvili, but that's by a Georgian author, and this is the only one of this list that I read previous to this challenge. And this book is a family saga, a very chunky book, and it follows several people in that family. And at the beginning it's marketed like this story of this family with a secret chocolate recipe that plays a big role on the book. It's not really that. It's mentioned at the beginning and some parts in the middle, but the chocolate recipe is not the main thing. I think each of these characters in this family are very distinct people, and some of them have more connections with, for example, the Russians again. There is one woman that discovers that she's a lesbian, and she's grappling with what to do about that. There are all these kinds of messed up characters that mess up with other people's lives, and everything is connected in a beautiful way. And also at the same time, because it's this family saga that goes over generations, it spans over Georgian history for 100 years, and you follow what happens in Georgia on those 100 years, in the last 100 years of history. So again, like the rise of the USSR, the fall of the USSR, all of these things, like the connections with Europe and what happens with that, all of that. It's very intense, it's very interesting, it's very captivating, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite books of the year I read it. So yes, I highly recommend. And for Kyrgyzstan, I read The Days Last More Than 100 Years by Chingiz Aitamov. Again, I'm butchering all these names, I'm sorry. But yeah, this one is a science fiction, and it's interesting because it's about space exploration, and it was written around the time of space exploration and the Russians going there and all of that. And it's very interesting because it was written at a time in which you were not supposed to really be allowed to criticize the Soviet Union, but this book is kind of it's like a satire about the Soviet Union through this science fiction lens. So that part was interesting. I have to say though that sometimes it did feel a little bit like out. I couldn't understand everything that was going on, and I think I didn't have the knowledge and historical knowledge of the region enough to understand all the references that it was making. Like, I got some of them and I enjoyed some of them, but I also recognized that some of the references completely went over my head, and I don't know enough about the region to catch all of them. But I think overall it was an interesting read. And then the last book I read was for Tajikistan, and that was a non-fiction book called The Birth of Tajikistan by Paul Bergne. I don't think Paul Bergne is from Tajikistan, but I just couldn't find anything else from Tajikistan, so I went with it. It's again a very short book, and it focuses mostly on the birth of Tajikistan, as the name says, but it's mostly about the relationship with the Uzbeks more than, also there is some Russian stuff, but it's morely with the Uzbeks. So like before the Russians came to the region and messed up everything. I think it was very specific in focus, and so I would have liked something a little bit more general about the history of Tajikistan more broadly. But yeah, I mean, this book was doing what it was doing fair enough, and it was good for what it was doing. I don't know any other books about history of Tajikistan, so I cannot compare it with anything else, but what I read was fine. And yeah, that's it. If you have any other recommendations for these countries, especially maybe Tajikistan is one that I couldn't find a lot about. But yeah, if you have any recommendations, I would love to know. Let me know if you have read any of these books, if you have loved any of these books, and until next video, bye!